Okay. Well, welcome everyone. It's good to see you all today. Hope you're all doing well, staying safe and healthy with the pandemic, wildfires, earthquake, and all what 2020 has thrown at us. I'm glad to see you all. I'm Simran Malhotra, principal with Ramey and Associates. We are leading the general plan update for the city of Palmdale. This meeting is being live streamed to YouTube on the Palmdale 2045 channel, and it's also being recorded. Let me start by calling the meeting to order at 6:31 p.m. And I'll start by, Andrew, if you want to move over to the next slide. And the next one. And we'll start with introductions. We have Carlene Saxton, who's the Deputy Director of Economic and Community Development for the City of Palmdale, and she'd like to make some opening remarks and also introduce other city staff who are on this call.
Great, thanks so much, Simran. Yes, good evening, everyone. And thank you for, sorry, we're having a little bit of technical difficulties. So hopefully there's no echo for everyone. So yes, I'm Carlene Saxton, Deputy Director of Economic and Community Development, also the project manager for the general plan. We're very excited to have everybody here. GPAC, once again, you are also committed, and we're very excited to be in front of you all again this evening and present some new information and have a lively discussion. We have some city staff here right now. We have Megan Taggart, our senior planner, and I don't know if you just, she's here. And then Ben Fiss, who's also our senior planner. And we also have Drew Pletcher, who is our Deputy Director of Economic and Community Development as well. So with that, I'll just say thank you so much. And we're excited to hear what you have to say and have a good discussion tonight.
Thanks, Carlene. The purpose of today's meeting is to talk about open space, parks, and conservation of, and we'll get into that in a little bit more. But the first order of the day is to look at. Let's do introductions for the GPAC. Next slide, please. As I call your name, if you can unmute yourself and verbally acknowledge your presence. Tony Avila.
Hello, everyone.
Juan Blanco.
I am here, and howdy all.
Lourdes Everett.
Present. Good evening, everyone.
Colby Estes. I think he's just joining. I see him here. We can't hear Colby yet. Laura Gordon.
I'm here. Oh, Colby's here. I'm sorry.
Hey, Colby. Teresa Hambro.
Hi, everyone.
Matt Harris.
Hello.
Aurora Hernandez.
Hi.
Pat Hunt.
Present.
Sherry Kanashiro. I don't see her yet. Terry Lamping. See her either. I know Joe Paricio couldn't make it today. Debbie Rutkowski Hines.
Hi, everybody. Present.
And Jason Zink.
I'm here. Hi, everyone.
Great. Well, welcome again, everyone. Next slide, please. Melissa will now lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Please stand up, place the hand over your heart, and let's begin.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the
United States of America, and
to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, and you may be seated.
Thank you, Melissa. Let's go to the next slide. We have meeting minutes from the last GPAC meeting, which was held on July 29th. Are there any corrections, changes, comments?
I have a comment. Would it be
Yes.
possible to get the minutes within a week or two after the meeting rather than 2 months later? Try and remember what was said.
Absolutely. We prepare those right away, so we can start sending those out as soon as they're ready.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other comments, questions? Hearing none, do we have a motion to approve?
I move to approve the minutes.
Second.
I'll second.
Okay,
Shall we launch our poll?
yes. It seems like that's oh, it's approved. 100 all approved. No edits or denials. So the minutes are approved, and with the note that we'll start sending those out, sending out the draft notes earlier than with the package for the next meeting. Okay, next slide, please.
Okay, so I'm just going to really quickly remind everyone some of the key features of Zoom. It's been a little while since our last meeting, so just a reminder, starting from the left side of your screen, the mute and unmute button, as well as the video turn off, turn on button. If you'd like to raise your hand or provide comments, you can do so by clicking the participants button, which is the third in. That'll take you to the other window you see on your screen here, and you have the option to click the blue raise hand button. That'll notify everyone that you'd like to say something. Please do stay on mute until we call on you. It just helps us stay really organized. And then the chat feature is really helpful if we need to send any links out or reminders to you during the meeting. Just have that open and be mindful of those chats coming from us. Next slide. And then a reminder, we did this in our last meeting, we're going to do it again tonight. We have multiple stopping points during our presentation. We'll be pausing for questions and comments, as well as doing the interactive polls. We have those available for members of the public who are watching on YouTube Live right now. There is a link in the YouTube description that'll take you to a comments forum where you can provide your responses to all of the poll questions, provide public comment, and ask questions.
I'd also like to add that when we do ask questions and comments, they are kept relatively brief so that we have an opportunity for everyone to participate. And then I was remiss in introducing our team members here. I am sorry. We have with us today folks from Rincon Consultants. They are leading the discussion today on the topic for today, parks, open space, and conservation. They are also going to be preparing the environmental impact report for the general plan update when we get to that stage later on in the process. So I'll start with Joe Power. He's a principal with Rincon. If you wanted to introduce yourself, and then I'll have the other team members do the same.
Hi, Simran. Joe Power here from Rincon. Pleasure to be here tonight. My camera has been working off and on, so it's probably going to cut out momentarily, but hopefully you'll at least be able to hear me tonight. Now I'll let Lexi Journey and Andrew Hatt introduce themselves.
Hi everyone, my name is Lexi Journey. I'm a senior planner with Rincon Consultants, and I'm also happy to be here with you guys today. Thanks for having us.
Hey everyone, my name is Andrew Hatt. I'm a planner with Rincon, and yeah,
I'm excited to be here.
Thanks, Andrew, Lexi, and Joe. And thank you, Sherry. She just was able to join, so wanted to welcome her as well. Okay, next slide. Before we jump into the meat of our meeting today, I wanted to briefly overview where we are in the process, and then also briefly share what we heard about with regard to the land use alternatives during the intensive engagement we've had over the last couple of months. As you know, we are wrapping up the third step right now. This is a third of 6 steps, which of a process that started about 1.5 years ago. Over the summer, we received extensive feedback on the land use alternatives, and now are moving towards the development of the preferred plan and policy development. We'll be coming back to you to review the preferred plan in the next few weeks. And then we'll develop additional policies and draft the general plan, and we expect to be at the hearing stage in the fall of 2021 to early part of 2022. We also will be conducting additional community engagement throughout that process. Next slide, please. As I noted, we conducted extensive engagement on the alternatives over the summer. We had focus groups, virtual workshops, survey, pop-up events, planning commission and city council workshops. And the results of this engagement is available on the project website for review. And this input will also be shared in greater detail with you all, the GPAC members, next week when you have in-person meetings with city staff. But I just wanted to make a quick note of what we have, the engagement that was conducted over the summer. Next slide, please. And with regard to the results, we briefly, again, very briefly, wanted to note that there was overall preference for alternative 3 for a variety of reasons, including the mix of jobs and that were proffered in that alternative, the housing choices that were built into that alternative, the flexibility offered, as well as the lower VMT caused by the mix of housing and employment uses, which meant that residents may not need to travel as far for work and hence reduce the need for long commutes. The alternatives also, other elements that were also liked, and some of them were in other alternatives, included the notion of having 2 medical districts, which allowed for better accessibility by residents. And then in terms of education districts, there was also a preference for 2 locations. When we develop the preferred alternative, we'll take all this feedback into account, and you'll get a chance to provide additional input at that stage. Next slide. And now to the topic for today's meeting. The general plan, next slide, please. The general plans are required to address open space, parks, and natural resources, as well as conservation of protected flora and fauna. 2 elements identified in the general plan guidelines are conservation element and open space element. And these are in the current general plan, and they will also continue to be included in the updated general plan. So what we wanted to do today was, and I'll hand this over to Lexi to briefly talk about what's in the current general plan, give us some existing conditions and background context for the work we have done so far, and then begin a discussion with you all about initial policy recommendations. So Lexi, hand this over to you.
Thanks, Imran. So before we jumped into the specifics about Palmdale, we wanted to give a big picture overview of what the regulatory framework that we're working with from the federal and state level. So the two state and federal requirements that the topics correlate to is first the Federal Endangered Species Act. You guys are probably familiar with this. It designates endangered and threatened species and develops programs to protect those species. And this program also provides states with funding to maintain those conservation programs. And then the California Endangered Species Act is very similar, but it has a lot more species designated that are specific to California. And this really comes into play during the environmental review process. So as a requirement of CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, the biological resources section of that environmental review really looks at all the different species that are listed under the California Endangered Species Act and sees if there's any significant impacts to those species. And if they are, then it's typically determined that there is a potential significant impact that's a product of that either project or different decision that the environmental review is evaluating. And then the third that we have here is the West Mojave Habitat Conservation Plan. So even though it's not state and federal, it's a regional plan. And Palmdale is a part of this conservation plan. And it's a really specific strategy to conserve over 100 plants, animals, and sensitive communities in the area. And it encompasses 9.4 million acres of both private and public land. And this is another layer on top of the California Endangered Species Act that provides more programs and ways to streamline that compliance with the Endangered Species Act, specifically for species in the Antelope Valley. So after I give that general overview, I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Andrew to talk about existing conditions specifically for Palmdale.
Hey everyone. So I'll first start off with talking about the existing conditions for parks, open space, and trails within Palmdale. So Palmdale has 20 parks currently, totaling about 365 acres. The biggest parks are Marie Kerr and Palomdale Vista parks. Amenities vary between parks. So there's a skate park, water park, public pools. It varies by the park itself. And currently Palmdale has a park service ratio with a goal of meeting 5 acres of parkland per 1,000 residents. That was in the last general plan. And currently Palmdale is meeting 45% of that ratio for about 2.25 acres per resident. And so if Palmdale were to be meeting that, or to meet that goal, it would need about 793 acres of parks. And then the city is interested in acquiring more open space land. That's in the 2019 Capital Improvement Program. And there are 76 acres of new neighborhood parks in the CIP. So here's a map of the parks in Palmdale. There's a pretty good spread of parks throughout. General concentration in the central to southeastern portion of the city. And Marie Kerr is up in the upper middle, and then Palomdale Vista is down in the center. So when talking about parks, they can be broken down into a few different categories based on size and amenities. So these categories are typically neighborhood parks, which are typically city-owned recreation facilities. They're meant to serve the residents in the direct neighborhood surrounding the park, so less than a mile. And they're generally about 5 acres, so on the smaller side. And for example, on the right is a photo of William J. McAdam Park. So that would be a good example of a neighborhood park. And then community parks are a little bit bigger at 5 to 20 acres, and those typically are meant to serve a wider group of residents who may live a little bit further away, about 1 to 2 miles from the park. And they might have a few more amenities or facilities. So that would be similar to Dominic Massari Park. And then regional parks, finally, those are typically bigger, and they might not be owned by the city. Typically, they can be the state, county, or a regional park district. And that usually is meant to serve multiple jurisdictions, not just one city or county. And a lot of these feature natural areas for passive recreation, as well as larger active recreational facilities. So when thinking about types of parks and who they're meant to serve in terms of proximity to these parks, this is a map that shows the time to the nearest park for Palmdale residents. And as you can see, there's a pretty good spread of people within 10-minute walks, 20-minute walks of the park, of their closest park. But there are a few areas that are a little bit more distant from parks. So it's this breaks that down here. And then when looking at the statistics for that map, about 82% of Palmdale residents are within a 20-minute walk of the closest park. So it's actually really good, and it shows that the city has placed parks in relatively good locations, and there's a relatively good spread. They're not all concentrated in one part of Palmdale. So that's something worth mentioning. And then moving next to open space and scenic highways. So open space is a little bit different than parks, and that refers to more undeveloped land with no buildings. And typically these are not within a city. They're the larger natural areas. So regionally, you could refer to the Angeles National Forest or the Kestic Lake State Recreation Area, just some examples around the Palmdale area. And for open space, one of the ordinances that Palmdale has currently is a Hillside Management Ordinance. So this allows for development while preserving open space, and it has different rules and guidelines for making sure that development is sensitive to the open space that is being developed in. And that the ordinance also talks about ridgelines and other prominent landforms, whether that's the Sierra Pelona Mountains, San Gabriel Mountains, the various ridges in the area. And then for scenic highways, there's one officially designated highway, and that is the Angeles Crest Highway. And that's I think by the state, and there's that section there. And then there's also city designated scenic highways in the area. So Barrel Springs Road, Sierra Highway, Bouquet Canyon, there's various in the city. And then finally, trails. So the amount of pedestrian and bike trails within the city itself are fairly limited, which is pretty common. There are also, however, various informal trails in the city's foothills. So some of the biggest trails in the area, the Ritter Ridge and Joshua Ranch Loop, that's 11 miles long, Barrel Springs, Avenue S, which is a bike trail. And in the Palmdale Active Transportation Plan, there's currently 117 miles of new multi-use trails called for the development of. I think that'll take us to the first question and poll.
Mm-hmm.
I had a
Do
question.
We have a question.
Yeah, I have a
Go
question. On the first slide, it says the conditions of the parks, and it rates them fair, good, etc. What determines that condition? Like what factors into making that decision, I guess is a better way to say it.
Andrew?
Yeah, so I'm looking at the slide right now, and that's from the Los Angeles needs assessment. And I think that would be maybe how I'm not exactly positive all of the factors that go into it. Maybe the quality of the grounds when they did the survey, the amount of amenities, things like that.
Okay, thank you.
It sounds like that's something we ought to look into just to verify though, and we can do that. That's actually a good question that we will look into and get an answer for you.
Yeah, I think this is Carlene. I think that perhaps maybe we can take a note of that and then send an email to the GPAC to provide some clarification on that one. That was a good question, Matthew. Thank you.
Yeah, I had a question about the Joshua trees. I was reading this morning that they've received a temporary federal designation as an endangered species with due to climate change, and then possibly going on the federal endangered species list permanently. Are we anticipating that affecting this plan in any way? Are we thinking about that? I'm just kind of wondering where we are there.
Debbie, that's a good question. We actually have talk about Joshua trees a little bit later on in the presentation. So hold that question and thought, and hopefully we'll address it during our presentation.
Great, thank you so much.
Other questions? Jason?
One question.
Jason
ahead,
has his hand up, so.
Oh, there it goes. Okay, just that there were some parks that weren't on the list, like Armagosa Wash and AC Warnick Park wasn't on there. I really wouldn't consider McAdam Park a neighborhood park. I'd consider it more of a community park because it has a pool and everything. And we used to always have the October festival over there too. I remember seeing a map that used to have loops around all the parks and the proposed parks. I don't know if it was from GPAC or another committee I was on that showed where the areas that are needed for parks. You know, so maybe we can find that and incorporate it into the next meeting. Also, the Joshua tree, there is going to be a designation for it, it looks like. So we need a plan on locating the areas that we want to protect. That way, when a developer wants to build, they can, you know, buy that land over there where we want to put an open space park, and they can go ahead and develop. That way, it's, you know, we can be still pro business, pro growth, but yet be responsible and conserve the most prime desert land in Palmdale. And that's it. Oh,
Thank you,
Scenic
Jason.
Highway. Yeah, just Scenic Highways, Mount Emma and Cheeseboro and 47th Street. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Were there other raised hands?
Yeah, we had one question that came through in the chat, and I think it was related to the definition of parks, mentioning that the Little League field is there, and asking about public access, walking to these facilities, and asking if it's a fair way to measure access and proximity. And if anyone wants to follow up with.
Yeah, it's kind of that we're talking about proximity to parks, and you're listing all the parks, but some of those parks are not really public use parks. Like I said, like the Little League, I know is not a public use park. So how does that kind of fall into this access to things that aren't really used for walking around or walking your dog or things like that?
Yeah, that's a good question, Colby. And Rincon folks, you may have additional thoughts on this, but most parks have, there's a lot of parks which have sports fields which are used by Little League or by AYSO or etc. But they often, not all the time, but often also have general areas which are open to the public. And so those parks are more accessible to those around. The access to parks analysis stayed at a pretty high level. It didn't get into what the amenities are at each park and how accessible it was to the immediate residents. And I think that's a fine-tuning exercise we can undertake. And also, I think there's always additional improvements to be made. The point of those two slides was that the starting point based on what's been achieved in the last 25 years, we've achieved a lot, and we can continue to make improvements. But we wanted to acknowledge the positive aspects of what's already been done. And Lexi or Andrew, if you had anything additional to add, or Joe for that.
No, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's all right. This is Joe, and I think, yes, I agree that that's an appropriate fine tuning of that analysis that we'll do as we move forward to identify not just that there's a park within a 10 to 20 minute walk, but what types of amenities and facilities are available, and try to fill in the gaps as appropriate.
Right. Other questions?
One. Oh.
Okay, folks. So I understand that the parks are counted whether or not they're usable. Is it possible to make a list of the parks that are run by the city, the parks that are associated with the school districts, and the parks that are kind of like third hand or private, so that we would have something in writing and we can refer to it instead of constantly asking and guessing about it?
Yeah, I believe the existing conditions report had that level of information, and we had sent that out, but we'll confirm that and share that with you all.
That's a good idea, Wayne.
The American Indian Little League, that about 25 years ago or so, that I was able to help the league get the city to come in and maintain the field. Every year, the parents and the league would get together and clean up the field and spend about, I don't know, a couple $1,000s on maintaining a field. And since it was right next to the Sands Park, it was kind of convenient. City Council came in and saw that there was a need to help sponsor underprivileged kids onto teams and that. So it opened it up to about 50 kids were being able to be sponsored on the teams because the city stepped in and helped maintain the field. So it was a benefit to the residents of that west side of Palmdale for kids to play Little League ball.
Thank you, Beth.
Should we move on to our polls?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Unless there are
So
any
we
more
have
questions.
Don't see anything yet from folks
Yeah.
online. So
Okay,
we
go
have
for
3
it.
polls that we're going to, we have 3 polls at this stopping point. I'm going to launch the first one now. This question asks, should the city of Palmdale continue to pursue a standard of 5 acres of parkland per 1,000 population? And your options are increase above 5 acres per 1,000, maintain at 5 acres per 1,000, or decrease below 5 acres per 1,000. We'll pause here for a second. Please submit your responses, and then we'll share the results in a few seconds. And if anyone is on YouTube Live, we have this question for you as well. If you click the link below in the description, it'll take you to another window where you can submit your response as well. Okay. I think we've got everyone. And the results should be up on your screen now. We can see that 25% said to increase, 58% said to maintain, and 17% said to decrease.
Thanks, Melissa.
All right. Let me get us to our second question here. I have to move very quickly. So our next poll question is launching now. What improvements are most needed to better the Parks and Recreation system in Palmdale? Your options include more parks within Palmdale, improved park facilities and amenities at existing parks, like bathrooms, sports facilities, and playgrounds, more bike lanes connecting parks and major points of interest, more trails for hiking and mountain biking near the city, require more open space within village centers.
This is a little bit of a trick question because all of these choices are desirable. What we are going to use your responses for is to get a general sense of priorities, like what is the most important in your mind.
If you haven't already, please submit your response. All right, I think we've got everyone. We'll close this poll and share the results. So we have 17% with more parks, 33% with improved facilities and amenities, 25% with more bike lanes, 25% with more trails, and 0% with the last option, which was more space within village centers.
So that looks like it's pretty spread out. And the top four are generally a priority within the city, to not just add more park space, but also improve access to them, and then to take advantage of the natural resources around with more trails for hiking and biking. So that's
Honestly, the last one regarding open space in village centers, that's probably private space anyway, and my guess is the city will want to be requiring that sort of thing with new centers anyway.
That's right.
And just to share, we have one response from someone online, and that response was to include more bike lanes connecting parks and major points of interest. So now we'll do our third poll for this stopping point. I'm going to launch that here now. This asks, which park types should the general plan prioritize in the future? Your options are neighborhood parks, community parks, regional parks, or other types of parks.
And keep in mind the general definitions that Andrew provided earlier.
Right. We're waiting on one person. There we go. Okay, and results are in. 42% suggest neighborhood parks, 50% community parks, and 8% at regional parks.
Thanks, Melissa. Later on, when we stop for the larger discussion, I'd like to hear from you in terms of what kind of amenities do you think we need in community parks, given that that has a slightly higher preference than neighborhood parks. What we heard during the alternatives phase from the general public as well as from council was the desire to see more neighborhood parks, which are closer to residents where people can walk to instead of having to drive to.
And then just to mention, we got one response from the public, which included a vote for neighborhood parks. Right, you can all minimize that screen.
Okay, Andrew, let's go on to the next slide.
I'll be handing it over to Lexi now.
Yeah, we're going to switch gears a little bit from parks and open space now over to conservation. So first we're going to talk about wildlife species. Again, about the West Mojave Habitat Conservation Plan area. As we discussed before, it's a regional program to protect a bunch of different sensitive species in the area. And it already ensures that biological surveys are conducted in Palmdale's significant ecological areas, which I'll show a map of where that is after that. And it also calls out for different types of surveys, potential takes that could happen per species, and specifically in the plan, it mentions the desert tortoise and the ground squirrel as existing in Palmdale. And the California Department of Fish and Wildlife uses this framework to protect the listed species. And again, other species include sage sparrow, burrowing owl, red-legged frog, and coast horn lizard. So if you go to the next slide, you can see the map of where this conservation plan area is, and you can see it's almost over the entirety of Palmdale. So it covers most development that would happen in the city. And then the next slide, you can see after this one, I'll show you the map of the significant ecological areas. But before we get to that, the general plan that exists now in the environmental resources element has already calls for these types of surveys and whatnot. So you guys already had these programs in place before the West Mojave plan came into place. And again, it preserves environmental resources to the extent feasible and make sure to promote only compatible and passive recreational uses in these sensitive areas. And we can go ahead and show the designated significant ecological areas like Big Rock Wash, Little Rock Wash, Ritter Ridge, Portal Ridge, and Alpine Butte. That's on the next slide. So as you imagine, a lot around the creek along there and in the eastern north part of the city. And then going on to the next slide. And we're gonna go to questions here in a poll, and then I promise the next section we're gonna talk about Joshua trees.
Any questions so far?
Any questions?
Okay.
Yeah, I just want to say, you know, the Barrel Springs Trail that the city of Palmdale has, the city only owns the trail, all the land on both sides of it. People think that's owned by the city and it's, you know, it's in conservation, but it's not. It's all in private hands. So that's, you know, we have this beautiful trail with all these beautiful junipers and Joshua trees and wildlife, and the Palmdale ditch that runs from Little Rock Dam to Palmdale Lake runs through there. It'd be so beautiful, but if we don't protect the area around the trail, then you're just going to have, you know, development. And we need to protect that whole area from Palmdale Lake to Uno Lake to the Indian Ponds, which is on 35th Street in Barrel Springs. That's natural ponds. A lot of people don't know Palmdale has that. And protect that whole area.
Thank you, Jason. We have some suggestions when we get to the policy discussion as to how we can preserve these areas, given that it's private property at this point. We'll talk about that later on. Other questions, comments? Melissa, do you want to run the poll?
Yeah. So we're going to launch our 5th poll, which asks, what are the most important local plant and wildlife issues in Palmdale today? Your options include pollution and contamination related to industry and agriculture, climate change and increasing wildfires, habitat preservation, wildfire and plant species such as Joshua trees, protection of threatened or endangered species, new development projects along the edge of the city, or lack of funding for natural reef conservation. And again, those watching on YouTube, click the link in the description below and you'll have the option to respond to this poll as well. Take another second here. I think we're waiting on 2 more responses. one more. If you haven't submitted it yet, please do so. There we go. And results are in. So we have 17% with climate change and increasing fires, 50% at habitat preservation, 8% at protection of threatened or endangered species, and 25% responding to new development projects along the outer edge of the city.
And we'll talk about habitat preservation in the next section. So that's a good segue to move over to.
I just want to make sure, this is Joe again, make sure everybody understands we recognize that these are not mutually exclusive. When you're preserving habitat, you're also protecting threatened and endangered species. So we certainly understand that there's a lot of overlap with some of these items.
Thank you, Joe.
Do you want to go ahead and move into the next slides? Right, now we'll talk about other natural resources, including vegetation and different wildlife habitats. So on this table here, you can see that the most common type of habitats in Palmdale include annual grassland, mixed chaparral, desert scrub, and sagebrush. And the habitats are generally concentrated in the northeast and southwest parts of the city. And of course, they are home to the protected plant and animal species, including Joshua trees and junipers. So if you go to the next slide, you can see a map of all the different natural communities that are within Palmdale. And you guys have probably seen this before because it's in the existing conditions report, but just wanted to show it again here. And then if you move on to the next slide, it's the same map, but we've called out the Joshua tree and juniper tree habitat. So as you can see, the Joshua tree is in the light yellow and more in the northern part of the city, and then juniper is in the purple towards the southern part of the city. So this slide is dedicated just to Joshua trees and junipers. So they're found in open woodlands with scattered trees and sparse ground cover of shrubs. And there's already an ordinance in Palmdale, the Native Desert Vegetation Ordinance, that's in place to protect the Joshua trees. And so any type of development that is going to potentially affect these trees, they need a desert vegetation preservation plan, and they also need a mitigation ratio where if a tree is damaged, you have to replace it double than the amount that is removed. And removal is not permitted unless defined by that preservation plan. And it also has different maintenance requirements for projects. And like someone mentioned earlier, the California Fish and Game Commission they just had a hearing last night and decided to list the Joshua tree under the California Endangered Species Act. So because that happened just last night, we don't know exactly how it's going to affect the plan, but we'll definitely look at the map and look at the land use scenarios and go from there.
And if I can add, it's a temporary designation at this point, and in 1 year, they will consider placing it on the permanent listing.
Yeah, and as you went through in the last meeting for land use scenarios and whatnot, they're really preventing sprawl. So it's also probably unlikely that this designation would affect that scenario that much. Go to the next slide. And we threw this slide in because under state legislation, the conservation open space element addresses water, mineral resources, and agricultural resources. So I'm sure you already know, but Palmdale has 3 seasonal streams and also gets water from the San Gabriel Mountains and the occasional rainstorms and the reservoirs. And some shallow flooding can be common in the floor of the Antelope Valley. And then in terms of minerals, Palmdale lies within the Palmdale production consumption region, which I'm sure you're aware because of mining that happens within Palmdale. And it is considered significant by the California Department of Conservation. So they just designate that to ensure that land uses are compatible with long-term mining and processing. And lastly, Palmdale does contain some agricultural land in the northeast part of the airport. So most of it is in LA County, but then there's a northern part of Palmdale that also has ag land. And so we have some maps to showcase these. This one shows the streams and water bodies within Palmdale. And then the next one shows where mineral resources are located, which makes sense because the mining occurs in the southeast portion of the city. And then lastly, we have a map showing the agricultural areas that are designated by the state as prime farmland. And so you see again, most of it is in the airport, but then there is some just north of that. So I'm happy to take any questions on that section.
How many of these streams in Palmdale are designated blue line?
In terms of how many are designated? What type
Yeah,
of
by the Department of Fish and Game.
That's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head, but we can definitely look into that.
Okay.
Yeah, Pat, if we can add that, you know, the Corps of Engineers does not have any designated water bodies within the city boundaries.
I know Amagosa Creek is designated a blue line creek by the Department of Fish and Game. They protect certain species of animals and fish and so on and so forth. So that's the reason I asked.
Yeah,
I saw one of the little blue lines going across the Trade and Commerce Center that isn't really a stream or anything. So it made me wonder about the designations.
Yeah, I think a lot of those fall with the SEAs, the ecological sensitive ecological area map follows the route of the streams. And as you pointed out, those are where the habitat areas are as well. So those are protected already by the current general plan.
I have just a statement, basically. The gravel mines, what the city needs to do in the general plan is actually have some kind of reclamation plan. In order, you know, once they're done with those pits, we need to have some kind of plan, whether it's going to be a park or a landfill or something. And we need to have a plan for that, you know, over the next 25 years when those, because Granite Construction, they're already done with their pit and it's open. So do we turn it into a big lake out there and have water skiing, or what do we do with all that area out there? And do we have the dirt bikes and stuff like that in the wash and flood control and water, groundwater things along Little Rock Wash?
Yeah, thank you, Jason. That's actually a really good point. And when we had the workshop with the city council last week, that the same issue came up during that meeting. And I know the city staff, they can provide an update here, but the city is already working with those operators to make sure that they implement the reclamation plans that they agreed to when they received their CUPs to operate their mining operations. Carlene, Megan,
yeah, it's Megan. I'll talk about it really quickly.
Yeah.
So each of the 8 mines is required to have a reclamation plan that is approved by our decision makers as well as by the state. And each mine has to annually review their reclamation plan to make sure that they're in compliance with all of the reclamation that they're required to do throughout the process and the life of their mine.
Thanks,
yeah,
Megan.
I just think that we need to have some kind of consultant do some kind of plan, some kind of visionary plan for that area. Antelope Valley is one of the only places in the whole state of California that doesn't have a conservancy district or a jobs corps program for the youth. So we're missing out on millions and millions of dollars that the state would give Antelope Valley every year to hire young people to do trails, to buy open space. And we've had 2 park bond measures and 2 water bond measures. Those conservancy districts received $1 billion and Antelope Valley received nothing. So I would like that to be a priority in the general plan, to develop a Antelope Valley Conservation District and Job Corps program for the young people. So we get annual funding from the state. We'd actually have the state pay people to run a park program to do our trails and everything like that, if we just got incorporated as a conservancy and establish a job corps. That's it.
Thank you, Jason. We'll certainly look into that further and bring back when we later on in the process. Other questions? Matthew, yes.
Yeah, I did have a question. So looking at the first slide, it showed the acreage and percentages for all the different type of habitats. Has any of them shifted, or we have the data from 25 years ago where we've seen an increase or decrease on certain type of habitats based on our current plan?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we got that data from the latest state data of natural communities. So we could potentially look in some older city documents to see if there's other data to be able to compare and contrast.
Then kind of a follow-up question, like obviously with Joshua trees being protected, we have very limited areas where we have, dense population of the trees. When we look at the bigger overall plan, do we have to take into account type of industries next to it? So if we put something that produces a lot of smog, what type of impact would that have on the trees itself? Is that type of data available? If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's also a good question. I think in terms of its listing right now, they probably haven't gone that far into those indirect impacts and more focusing on the direct impacts of development and whatnot. But there might be studies, like academic research studies on those indirect impacts, and the whole listing was because of climate change. So they're also looking at another really broad impact to list it.
Yeah, thank you.
Teresa?
I was just curious how, there might be a number already, but how many Joshua trees are saved? For example, if there's a track area, a development of houses, like I'm thinking of my area right here, and I'm sure there were a lot of Joshua trees in this area, acres and acres. But then when I drive up and down a street, I might only see 4 or 5 Joshua trees. So what is the ratio of Joshua trees that are saved when a development does go up?
I think I'll ask city staff to respond to that from past development projects. How many proportionally are protected?
Hold on.
Carlene or Megan?
Yes. So I think that Megan and I are gonna tag team this one. So we've actually done a lot of research recently into this to prepare for the potential listing of the species. And we have a existing native desert vegetation ordinance to protect Joshua trees. And our city staff over the last 13 years, we've done over 500 transplants, and we've only had 4 unsuccessful transplants. So we've had a 99% success rate with that plan. And that requires a permit through the city. And one of the things that we're trying to do right now is coordinate with the Department of Fish and Wildlife to obtain some sort of delegation authority to see if we can use our existing municipal code to kind of monitor and address the impacts to Joshua trees. That's an active conversation, and we'll report back should things change and we have success. But right now, that's kind of the status. And then Megan's going to go into just a tiny bit of detail about what our existing ordinance requires, so that there's a little bit of context there too.
Sure. So for each project that has to do a native vegetation plan, they have to have a qualified professional go out on the site and sort of tag all the trees to see which ones are viable and which ones are not. And then developers are required to relocate or save in place at least 2 trees per acre. And then that's all documented in the vegetation plan. And then it's also required to do a 2 season maintenance plan as part of the vegetation plan to make sure that the trees are thriving for at least 2 seasons.
Thanks, Megan. Tony?
I guess this question's for Carlene or Megan. Now, do they have adopt a Joshua Tree type of program for regular Joe citizen where, you know, they take a tree out of a development area and you can actually use it as a landscaping option? Anything like that?
Yeah, so as part of our municipal code and this native desert vegetation plan, the developer is actually required to notice to the public for 30 days prior to any transplantation. I don't know if that's actually a word. Any transplanting of the trees to the general public to see if people want them for, you know, whatever use that they would like, but obviously for the successful movement of the tree. So yeah, I mean, Joe Schmo can come up and work with one of those developers, and it's in the newspaper, and you can go and get one of those trees for free.
All right, thank you.
Do you keep track of the Joshuas that are on private property, such as the golf course, Antelope Valley Country Club?
I'm sorry, Pat, can you repeat your question?
Yeah, are you familiar with the number of Joshua trees that are on private property, such as the Antelope Valley Country Club? If you play golf like I do, you'd know that there's thousands of them out there. But no, there's probably just hundreds, but there's huge stands, beautiful stands of Joshua trees out along the golf course. So
yeah, there are a significant amount within the city of Palmdale, and that was part of our early argument a couple of months ago when we were first kind of notified about this, is that it's not rare in Palmdale, and we're doing a great job of protecting the trees. So hopefully we can have some successful coordination with the Department of Fish and Wildlife to kind of move that forward and keep some local control versus some state control. But like I said, we're going to push as hard as we can and then report back to the group.
I'd like to point out that 30 years ago, when I was on this committee doing the plan, and we looked at those, I used to race dirt bikes, and I know how dangerous the Joshua tree can be. They hurt. And so looking at the big picture of where do you make them move them or make them stay, you know, the developer keep them in place. And, you know, the danger of those things poking little kids in the eyes and hurting people was taken into consideration, because they are very dangerous. They really hurt. So that's just something that we tossed around back then, and I think needs to be looked at now.
Yeah, thank you, Pat. You know, one other thing to consider is to try and demarcate areas which are more remote, where Joshua trees can be moved to, so they are in more of a, you know, the natural habitat and are not in somebody's front yard or in a, you know, near or next to a play field or a tot lot where there is the danger of someone getting injured. Okay. Other questions, thoughts? Okay, let's move on. Next slide, please.
All right, so after we've gone through those existing conditions, now I'm briefly going to talk about the existing programs and policies that are already in place in Palmdale. So I feel like we already talked about the native desert vegetation ordinance. But there's also, we put some policies in the existing general plan up here. Definitely don't expect you to read all of them, but just wanted to show them so you can see the actual policies. And a lot of them go towards protecting open space. There's also one about implementing a city's hillside management ordinance. And there's also a policy towards the bottom about equity, located varied parks to meet all residents' needs. And so it's pretty awesome that you guys had that down in 1993 and have been doing a really good job at implementing that policy. And then over to the next slide. And so going from the existing to what we want to do in the future, wanted to bring up some things that we've heard from the community so far. So the top ones being more open spaces that incentivize walking and biking. Also more trails and bike paths to connect the open space. Also more neighborhood parks and recreational opportunities, specifically in the heavily populated areas, and to designate an area to preserve the Joshua trees. Those were the main ones that we've heard from the community. And so for the policies and programs that we want to bring forward to you in the discussion next, I'll go through those. So the first recommended policy is to consider establishing an urban use boundary that protects and enhances open space. So the general plan already has the specific land use designations, but this boundary would be another layer of protection that could protect open space by clearly identifying areas that are specifically open space versus urban use. So just another planning layer of protection that would be a possible option. The next policy is considering developing a coordinated biological system that would include pre-approved mitigation areas, biological resource core areas, wildlife corridors, and linkages to allow wildlife to travel throughout their habitat ranges. And it would avoid adverse impacts to wildlife movement corridors and nursery sites. So again, Palmdale already has a lot of policies and ordinances in place to protect biological preserve, but they could have a policy to really focus on the different corridors of wildlife habitat and linkages that are really important to species success. So kind of what someone was talking about earlier with the creeks and whatnot, a policy like this would address that. And then the next policies, another one would be consider development incentives for protection areas or new parks. So example of that could be a transfer of development right programs. So this would be for people that have private property in an open space area and they still want to get the economic benefit of having that property. They could transfer their development rights to somewhere else for maybe higher density in an urban space. And then once they did that, they could preserve that area under a conservation easement. So that's just one example of a program that could happen. The next policy is to develop new parks in Palmdale to further increase the equity and access. One's pretty straightforward. The next one is consider new funding opportunities for building new and maintaining current Palmdale parks. So that could be like grants, event fees, partner with an NGO, or specific development fees. And then lastly, the policy is to promote bicycle and pedestrian connections throughout Palmdale. So next slide. So that's what we have for the overall policies, and open the floor to discussion of those.
If you can actually, Andrew, if you want to go back to the previous slide, maybe we'll start there. Now, in response to what Jason had mentioned earlier about trails in scenic trails that are already in place, but the adjacent property is in private ownership. The TDR program can be used to apply a conservation easement on that property, while the development that would otherwise have occurred on that site is located elsewhere within the city limits, which in areas which are more conducive to development. that's a program and policy we can explore further if it seems to resonate with you all. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, my thoughts are, I think the city of Palmdale should go out and buy a couple 100 acres of prime area now while the land's cheap. And that way, when a developer has to do mitigation, the city will get reimbursed that money that they paid for that park through the through the developer fees. So there's already an area designated that the city owns, and then the city could sell credits to the developer. That way the developer doesn't have to go around the whole city, or a lot of times what they do is they go out to California City and preserve land out there and don't preserve land in Palmdale. So, or they do another land on the west side. So we need something in Palmdale where the developers can pay to preserve land already owned by the city of Palmdale. Another policy.
Thank you, Jason. Let's see, who else had their hand raised? Oh, you're all quiet today.
I was going to say, in response to Jason's idea there, I think that the city's already using airport property for areas to mitigate those types of issues. And I think when the city ends up taking over the airport, that it kind of answers that question.
Thank you, Pat. What about the notion of allowing, providing development incentives to protect habitat, whether it be for Joshua trees or other protected species, to either have that development be elsewhere or there be financial incentives to not develop?
Well, what are you talking about? Open space and using that as mitigation ground as well? Like up in the foothills along Barrel Springs Trail, things like that?
That's right.
That's what I think that the city's already been looking at. I know that we talked about that years ago too.
And do you have any thoughts to share as to how the discussions went then? You know, you have a lot of history with the city, so it'd be good to hear your perspectives on,
as far
as discussions at the time. Oh, you muted yourself.
As far as the Joshua trees go, it was uncharted territory. Nobody knew. I think Tony Ball back then was the arborist that experimented with it. And there were a lot of failures, but there was a lot of success out of that on how to really transplant Joshuas and help them survive. So we've come a long ways with that. And I don't think we lack areas to transplant them. I think that there's plenty of areas around town that the city that will work. So there's mitigation can happen in many different ways, and the developers are really creative. They're all over it. I mean, but they'll cut corners if you let them, and then some of them just go all out. Ritter Ranch is one of the guys that jumps in there and makes things right. They do things, you know, in the past they've done things over and beyond. So, you know, it just depends upon you know, who the developer is and what the issue is. There's a lot of I don't know, a lot of wiggle room.
Thanks, Pat.
Yeah, I would just like to add that you know, there's been a lot of talk, but there's been talk about this since 1990 of designating areas to save, but yet the city has never done it. So I disagree with Pat as far as them designating areas that should have been saved long before in the last 30 years. So, and there's not one area that's preserved in the city of Palmdale.
Hi, Jason. Actually, this is Carlene. And actually, we have the Amargosa Creek area, and we actually are saving that in perpetuity. and there's some trails there, and that is designated as a landing site for some of our Joshua trees. So it's actually going to be, like I said, saved in perpetuity. It's something that we've worked through with the Department of Fish and Wildlife as well. So that is a very large area in the city that we have specifically designated for trails, as well as preservation of those species and a potential relocation site. So that's just one of them. I think there's a couple others, but we've been very active in that site recently. So.
Yeah, but I guarantee you there's not 5 Joshua trees on that whole property. I was born and raised here, and there's no junipers or anything over there. That all has to be replanted. That has to be taken. It's not natural state property that we need to save in the city of Palmdale.
Hey, Jason, thank you for your comments. We'll take those into account as we further develop policies and start looking at areas for designation for as landing sites for Joshua trees and other native vegetation. I wanted to switch tacks a little bit, and earlier on, when we asked about what kind of parks do we want to see in the city, and there was kind of a balance between community parks and neighborhood parks. Wanted to get a sense from those who picked community parks, what kind of amenities do you think a community park should have in the future versus a neighborhood park, which would be more, low key, probably have a tot lot, some open areas, and just have fewer amenities, partly because of size limitations. But thoughts on community parks, what kind of amenities do we want to see? Who wants to go first? Teresa, go for it.
I would like to see more swimming pool areas. I think that since we're in the desert and it gets really hot, I don't think we have enough areas for families to cool off near their homes. So I would like to see more swimming pools.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, who hasn't shared yet? Aurora, would you like to share your thoughts on this?
I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question? I'm so sorry. Because I have I have my baby here and I'm like kind of had trouble hearing.
No worries. I posed the question that several GPAC members want to see more community parks in the city, and we wanted to see if you had thoughts on what kind of amenities should be in these future parks.
Well, to me personally, I think that one of the most important things that we can add is access to like bike trails, I think, or something that like around the park, because I know that a lot of times there's kids there and you can't really ride bikes like, like through the grass, and it makes it really difficult for people to enjoy themselves because there's kids who take their scooters to the park. And so I think that trails, are really important.
Okay, so what I hear you saying is not just have open passive areas for recreation, but also have active trails which can be used for more active walking, biking, rollerblading, scooters, etc. Okay, that's good to know here. Thank you. Anything else?
Maybe improved connectivity between parks and residential areas, for example, for bicycles and whatnot. Maybe I
think that's a really good idea.
I thought that was part of it.
Thank you.
I had
Matt,
something.
Matt. Mm-hmm.
I voted for the neighborhood parks, but talking about community parks nationwide, it's a pandemic where youth is unable to have the facilities to practice for baseball, even soccer and different sports like that. And it's something I see here as well. There's not a lot of natural areas where in the parks where they can actually, practice their t-ball or little league or et cetera. Very limited to the field space. Obviously this is pre-COVID, but after we get through COVID, definitely, the youth sports is really important to our community.
Oh, thank you for that. Tony?
I'm like Matthew. I just, the community park concept, instead of, looking at neighborhood parks and looking for just a small piece of property, I think we could expand the current parks if there's properties adjacent to it. I'm more of a big city guy, Central Park kind of guy where everything's all inclusive. And I've seen many parks like that, and I really, really like them. I just like the community participation in those parks. But it takes a lot of space, a lot of room. And if you have it, build it and they will come. And I think like Marie Kerr offers that. They have parking lot space next to some of these, or next to the park, as well as additional space out towards the east. And I think, if you can expand those particular parks, I think it'd be a benefit to the community, and you can, add bike paths, and people can jog, and people can have, soccer practice fields and so forth.
Great. Thank you, Tony. Yeah, often folks want to see neighborhood parks so you can walk or bike to them more easily instead of having to get in your car to go to those. But another way around that is to have improved connectivity, as Joe mentioned, so you can ride your bike to those larger facilities, avoiding the need for getting in a car. Jason, very briefly.
Yeah, just briefly. Basically, in Arizona, every housing tract, they have walking trails all through the housing tract, and they all connect to the other housing tracts, and then they all connect to open spaces. Also, Palmdale is the only city I know of that has all this sewer water, this reclaimed water, and we don't do anything with it. Every other city I go to, the new cities, and even the old ones, they use their reclaimed water. They put a community lake, like a little small lake, 1 acre lake or 2 acre lake, and they have a nice trail that goes around it, and they have picnic areas just like Apollo Park, Balboa Park down in LA. It's crazy that all this water, Palmdale Water District wants to spend $200 million to dump all that water out in the middle of the desert, way out there, and then take a water pipeline 15 miles, pump it uphill back to Palmdale to reuse it. I say, why can't we build all these little lakes in all these parks and make Palmdale a paradise? I think it's just common sense.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Jason. Let's see. Sherry, do you have any thoughts on amenities in parks, community or neighborhood?
I like already what everyone else has said about the swimming pools and the trails for biking and things like that. I think Marie Kerr has really nice area where they have like exercising stations, kind of like throughout the walking areas. I think that's really cool. A lot of people could use that, especially in the outdoors and do those. It's not just like a plain walking type area. Yeah, I'm everything everybody said so far is pretty good to me.
Good, thank you. So let's move on to another question. Are there any particularly underserved areas within the city when it comes to parks and recreation facilities where you think there should be more amenities provided? So, the parks access map and the graph showed that, 80% or 82% of residents can walk to a park within 20 minutes, which is great, but certainly we can improve that, lower that number if we can provide additional parks. But I wanted to get thoughts on if there were any particular geographies or neighborhoods within the city that you all felt were particularly lacking.
I'd like to, basically talk about the west side of Palmdale. I think our needs are being met right now, but what I see as part of the issue is that Marie Kerr is really inaccessible to people that have very small children. I'm talking like babies and strollers.
I see.
But I think that's being addressed with the new Rancho Vista Park and then amenities in the Arnie Quinones. I think that's going to solve that problem. I noticed that the new Rancho Vista Park wasn't on the map, as several people mentioned. Some of the parks are missing. But I just think that how you get to the park is a big deal. And if you've got a small child, it's a lot to ask them to cross a busy street like 30th Street West or any of those. So I think neighborhoods being able to access a park safely is important too.
Yeah, thank you, Debbie. Laura, do you have thoughts?
They've all been mentioned, so we're okay.
Great, thank you. Let's see, anyone else?
Yeah, I'd just like to say
Colby?
that,
Can I chime in here for a second?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah,
so
please, go ahead,
the pools
Juan.
were mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Pools have been mentioned, but those are seasonal activities because they're not enclosed. If the pools were enclosed, they could be utilized year round. Number one. Number two, all the developments that have gone in, including mine, should have had mini parks or sitting areas assigned to it. Mine was supposed to, but instead a house was put in its place. So in the future, development should have sitting areas for at least new mothers that have children that can get out the house and sit down. That's just for starters, but there's a lot more to be had. But I just wanted to touch on that.
Okay, thank you, Juan. When we were discussing the alternatives, I had briefly mentioned that as we start developing the regulations that go with the various general plan designations, we will begin to put in requirements such as that. So we will have requirements for private residential development to provide some of those amenities within those developments, so that as you mentioned earlier, folks with or mothers with infants who are taking their kids out in strollers can just go to that area within their development without having to go too far from home. And of course, the larger parks, which are further away, are always available. In this pandemic, we are also seeing that people aren't able to go to those public parks. So building in more amenities in residential development in the future, I think will only serve us well. I see a bunch of hands. Lotus, and then you, Laura.
Hello. I was listening to Jason's suggestion with respect to reclaimed water. And I know that we don't really use our parks during the summer, really hot summer areas. And I thought it would be maybe it's a little crazy to you guys, but I thought, the dancing waters over at the Grove and the dancing fountain at the Grove, I wonder if we can install something like that for kids or to utilize during those really hot days, to where people can actually cool off rather than plunging in the park, somewhere where people can actually enjoy the park during the summer, not just at the end of the day where it's dark. Thank you.
Thank you, Lotus. Laura?
Sort of going off on and said year-round pools, so enclosed pools, or the top opens during the summer and it's closed during the winter, because people need pools all year round, just not during those 4 months of summer.
Thank you, Laura. Tony?
If I can go back to Rancho Vista, Park, I know that COVID has impacted the city coffers and things like that. Is everything going according to plan? Are they going to break ground here soon at Rancho Vista Park, since we're talking about parks?
Sure, I can go ahead and talk on that a little bit. So I believe that the plan is to break ground in November. on that park. There's been a lot of movement, as you know, a little bit of delay with COVID and the pandemic. That's why we were anticipating actually to be under construction this month, but just with everything going on, it's been pushed back a bit, but I believe that shovels will be in the ground in November.
Awesome, because I've been here 30 years, and I think Pat will tell you that was in the plans 30 years ago, and I'm thinking it was during the economic crisis, and here we go again. I'm thinking, are they going to do this again? We're not going to have a park for the next 20 years, so I'm glad something's going on. Okay,
yep, it'll be
thank
soon.
you, Carlene.
Matt, I'll have you go next, but I was going to ask Andrew if you can stop sharing your screen so then everyone can see the whole gallery. That would be great. And then we'll put it back up when we get to the latter part of the presentation. Go ahead, Matthew. Matt, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Going back to your original question, you asked, looking at the map and the density and the walking distance and such, it really looks like we're underserved. I believe it's Avenue S and between Sierra Highway and 25th Street East. You know, there's a high density of houses and residents, and it seems like they have the farthest walking distance in a sense, if I'm looking at the map correctly. Something to consider.
Thank you. And that is also the area where the alternatives consider additional housing. So I think it'll be important to provide for additional park space there.
I just want to add something to Matt too. There's not one city park north of Palmdale Boulevard on the east side of Sierra Highway, and there's not one city park east of Sierra Highway south of the railroad tracks. So that's why I was talking about we need to kind of look for areas of where we need parks in the future. That's it.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Jason. Usually in general plans, we don't locate parks very specifically because they usually fall on private property, and you don't want to take away all developable value from properties. But what we do is begin to identify general areas where parks should be located, and then city staff prioritizes acquisitions in those areas.
I just want to add, the reason it's important to already designate those areas is that's how you build the trails and how the developers build the trails to lead to those parks. So that's why it's important to get those areas designated so developers know how to plan to get to them with trails and bike lanes and stuff like that.
Thank you. Other thoughts on this idea, Patrick?
Yes, I think that when we start looking at the new downtown and then city centers in different places out on the east side, that's a pretty good opportunity to add like park-like features to those designations. So I think that, you know, they're nice gathering points and places that maybe a fountain, you know, in the summertime, things like that would work.
One of the ideas that was about open space in the village centers, and that, as Joe had noted, would most likely be public spaces, but on private property. So you require developers to provide that publicly accessible space with their smaller areas. They're often paved, but they're accessible to everyone. So they could have water fountains, seating areas, and other amenities that are developed and maintained by those property owners, but are accessible to everyone. So it doesn't burden the city with ongoing maintenance as well.
That's a good idea. But realistically, the developers will put those types of things in, and then the city ends up, you know, it's dedicated to the city, and the city ends up maintaining them. Because private property, when markets get tough and there's a lot of foreclosures and things get shut down, those things will get shut down as well. So that's when the city usually steps in.
Yeah, again, these kind of spaces are usually in the scheme, they're not acres of land. They are, tens of thousands of square feet. So they're not huge. So they are, the maintenance costs are also more limited. And since they are on private property, they tend to be maintained better. So switching gears a little bit, wanted to hear your thoughts on how the city should balance trade-offs between natural resource protection and economic development. Because in certain areas, for example, between the 14 freeway and Plant 42, there is pressure to build more employment type uses. All the alternatives considered some variation of that. That is also the area where there are existing stands of Joshua trees. From your perspective, how should the city balance those two competing goals?
Well, we've got a
Debbie?
policy for the Joshua trees, correct? So if we've got a policy for the Joshua trees where we're moving them, isn't that part of our solution right there, is developing that policy and deciding how we're going to implement it?
That's right.
That area out there, it's the ACU zone for Plant 42. So we really want to preserve it so that it doesn't interfere with the mission of Plant 42. Mm-hmm. So we need low human density uses, warehousing, maybe truck parking, trucking, things like that. And then your natural trees and Amargosa Creek runs through the middle of that area out there. So it just lends to preserving trees and wildlife, natural habitat as well.
I think all of us would agree that we need the economic development. We need the businesses to move in, and that's where the policy comes in, is how are we going to balance the two?
Yeah, Tony, I see your head nodding. Do you have thoughts to add?
Well, everybody keeps talking about balance. I mean, balance is always important. You don't want to go, to one side or the other. So as long as we have balance and we have a way to control that, I think that's what we need to do. That's what's important.
Thank you, Tony. Melissa, are there any questions? I've neglected to ask you. Are there any questions coming through our YouTube channel?
Yeah, so I've been monitoring our public comment forum for the public, and we don't have any comments or questions from the group yet. If you're watching live on YouTube, don't forget in the description below, there is a link for you to provide public comment as well as questions and comments on the presentation. We'll be doing public comment in the next section here, so please submit those if you do have anything you'd like us to share.
Thanks, Melissa. Joe, Lexi, Andrew, are there other questions that you think we should be asking this group and getting input on? Put you on the spot here.
I think this is a really interesting discussion. I like the idea of pools. I was wondering, and you kind of already proposed this, but now that we've talked about other things, if there's any other amenities that people are thinking, especially now in the face of climate change and potential for the areas to get hotter, any other things that this group could think of that the city could implement to help maybe mitigate some of those impacts in the future.
I kind of really like that idea that was mentioned earlier, using wastewater to create one of those little fountains that kids can play in during the summertime. kind of like they have at Universal Studios, and they stand on it, just water comes shooting up out of the ground. That seems like a really fun thing for, you know, Ponset Lawn Square or some central location like that, where there'd be some kind of fun water amenity like that. I really like the idea of using reclaimed water to do something fun like that for kids.
Thank you, Debbie. Let's see. Another question we had for you are, you know, we've talked about wanting more park space, preserving Joshua trees and habitat. Are there other pressing issues related to open space and recreation that we haven't talked about yet that you all think we should?
One thing I was thinking while discussing everything is we're neglecting to talk about dog parks. You know, we have a large one on the east side. Unfortunately, I have to go to Lancaster to, you know, take my dogs to the park. So having some space for the dogs, you know, as a community, we have a large population of dogs. So something to consider.
Thank you. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up one of the main things. Lake Palmdale has over 70 species of birds. It's one of the most unique spots in the high desert. There's no other place like it. And we need to emphasize protecting that habitat around there. And also, like I say, there's no reason why we can't have an Apollo Park on the east side of Palmdale with trails and recreation things and stuff like that, and take aqueduct water and recycled water and make this place a paradise. I think it could really make Palmdale something great. I really do.
Thank you, Jason. The issue of the habitat areas for bird species around Lake Palmdale is documented, and Lexi, Andrew, and Joe, I believe there are some protections in place already. Do you know?
Yeah, definitely birds is one of those types of animals that have had protections for a really long time. So any type of development or project, there's already a lot of federal and state bird policies in place. And specifically looking at nesting birds is a really big priority. And so especially under your West Mojave Conservation Plan, any type of development has to do nesting bird surveys before development goes into place, and then right before development takes action. So there are already some pretty strict regulations around protecting birds.
And I'm sorry, I don't know, maybe this is already something that's done, but I mean, from what I'm hearing described there, it sounds like the kind of place that could even be an interesting bird watching place. And maybe that's something that the city could think about if they haven't already, is to turn that into more of a real amenity. I mean, I know where I live in Ventura, we have an area up near the beach that the city has created a trail around a wetland area that's a very popular bird watching spot for locals and for visitors.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. We had begun to have some preliminary discussions with the Audubon, Antelope Valley Audubon, and we'll try and continue to work with them to see what other options there are. Okay. Other thoughts on conservation or open space, parks?
We got one message. Oh, this will be quick. We have one comment from the chat, just following up on the idea of additional amenities at parks. That could include misters and additional fountains just to help people cool off in the hotter months.
I was just gonna see if anyone in the group has any thoughts, because I feel like it hasn't come up yet on current park maintenance, and if there's any thoughts of how that is currently, things that maybe could be improved, or yeah, just general thoughts like that, because I know it came up earlier with the rankings on that one list from LA County. So yeah, just curious to see if anyone had any thoughts.
And I think under that umbrella too, you could talk about park safety. If anyone has any opinions on that.
Well, I think a lot of that came up at the park meetings, was about the safety, about when they're going to be closed and the lighting. And I think that was kind of, at the park meetings were really informative and provided a lot of that. And because I think neighbors that were there, that was one of the main concerns. It was what happens at those parks after the sun goes down. What's the security in the bathrooms? What are those like? Because I know a lot of the discussion about the bathrooms was centered around security. So actually, I think the city has done a really great job in informing us and keeping us adrift of what's going on with the parks at those park meetings where the list was generated.
Thank you, Debbie. Lourdes, did you have any thoughts on park maintenance?
Actually, I just had, and I don't know how, well, I'm going to just ask it anyway.
Please do.
Now, with respect to our wildlife, the animals and things like that, I know during the summer, again, you know, and it is always hot in our area. And I'm looking at the 3 seasonal streams, and I know when we get rain, when we have rain, they're filled with water, but there are many times where it's dry. Is there any way that we can conserve and keep the water to where, with also thinking about making sure that it's mosquito abatement, but to where wildlife can actually thrive and have a place to where they can go to, have a place to be able to drink and things like that. I mean, we can utilize the area. I mean, I don't know if that's realistic, but that's my thought. Thank you.
Yeah. I'll ask our Rincon folks to respond to that, if that's technically feasible or realistic.
Yeah, I would be curious to see. I feel like it's a super interesting idea what California Fish and Wildlife would think about that, because they're just very protective of their streams and keeping it as natural as possible and like not messing with the seasonality and the natural patterns of species in the area. But I don't see anywhere there could be maybe discussions about that topic, especially as we're already kind of influencing the habitat, and if climate change can affect them in one way, maybe that's a potential way to mitigate some of those impacts. It's definitely an interesting thought.
Yeah, we can explore that further. So
yeah,
thank you, Lourdes.
Regulatory and engineering hurdles, but it doesn't mean that that's not worth exploring.
Yeah. Tony, I see you have your hand up. You're muted though.
I was just going back to what Joe said about Ventura and bird watching, and they have, preserves set up for that. And I know if you have never been over to K8 and 30th Street West, there's a preserve there in Lancaster it's pretty awesome. You walk, down the lane and you get to see animals and things, and it's pretty much in the middle of the city. And it would be great if we could do something like that in Palmdale. And if you get the opportunity to do that, it'd be a good thing. They have a great Christmas display too, just on a side note.
Thank you, Tony. Well, we have a few more minutes. before we move on to the last phase part of the presentation. And so are there any other questions, thoughts? This has been a really interesting discussion, and some great ideas have come out, gives us a lot to explore further.
I think that maybe we could try and get better access to the Ritter Ranch area where the dam was built, and the water probably pools behind that. It is a blue line creek, and they had to jump through tremendous amount of hoops to build that dam to control the flow out of Leona Valley. And then Little Rock Dam, below the dam, there's always water being released from the dam. And you go from Little Rock Dam down to the 138, and it's rich with wildlife and pools and all kinds of things. So I think we have those things that Lourdes was talking about. We just don't have very good access to them.
Thanks for that, Patrick. Let's see, Jason, you have your hand up very briefly. Could you share your thoughts?
I just had 3 little things that I wrote down, and I'm pretty much done. East Side, just thought out there, an East Side golf course, since there's one on the west side, having the city take over the flood control basins, so we can use those flood control basins for recreation and for jogging trails around them, put trees around them. I'm talking about the Dry Town Water Park, that huge water basin, and it just looks like one big dry eyesore. Why couldn't there be a jogging trail with trees around that, and we could dump some recycled water in that and make it into a lake? And the other thing is, are we going to talk about bike lanes, or is that a part of the transportation?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. That is part of transportation, but it's, as with most things, those are all these aspects of our cities are integrated with each other. So, today we've been talking about the desire to connect various parks, not just to each other, but also to make it more accessible for residents to get to them. And then when we talk about transportation, we will have some specific recommendations on where those connections should be. And at the time, we'll be able to see where these current parks are located and how the connectivity matches up with those. And that actually is a good segue into going back to our presentation. Andrew, do you mind resharing the PowerPoint and moving to the next slide? If you can scroll through, we went through that. Melissa, is there any official public comment?
We don't have anything at this time. For those who are watching online, if you have any public comments, please submit them as soon as possible. We'll be closing the public comment form at the end of the meeting. If you have follow-up notes you'd like to send, you can email them to the team at generalplan@cityofpalmdale.org, and we'll make sure they get into the meeting notes.
Thanks, Melissa. Next slide, Andrew. Thanks. So we'll be coming back to you all in late October, early November. We're still trying to finalize the date with the preferred alternative. And this will be, as I mentioned earlier, a composite of what we have heard from the community, the direction we got from the Planning Commission and City Council. There'll be elements from different alternatives that were expressed as being preferred, and then we'll also look at feasibility as we incorporate those. So we'll bring that back to you at our next meeting. And then after we make any refinements, we will be doing some additional analysis, both for transportation as well as fiscal impact, as to what impact it has on the city's fiscal health. So that'll be a very interesting discussion, not at the next meeting, but following that. And then we'll continue to meet with you over the next several months on other policy topics. You know, the upcoming ones include health and equity, safety, and then of course transportation and land use. So stay tuned on all of those. We expect to have the more formalized preferred alternative back out to the public for public review in the first part of next year. And then following that, we'll dive in deeper into all the details of writing the general plan. So look for email soon with the date for our next GPAC meeting. Carlene or city staff, did you have anything to add at this point?
Yes, we just wanted to say again, thank you to the group. Our GPAC, I think, is great. You guys always provide wonderful input and insight. So thank you for being actively engaged and for your time tonight. Also, Councilmember Carrillo is viewing via YouTube, and he just wanted to thank everyone for participating and their continued hard work. So thank you from city staff as well as our decision makers and everything. And I hope you guys have a wonderful night, and we're excited to see you at our next meeting. And excited to see all of you in our smaller groups in the next couple of weeks.
Or next.
Thanks, Carlene.
Meeting next week, right? Monday or?
Right. The team has various dates with the smaller groups coming up in next week. And then I think there's one first week of October. Looks like Megan unmuted herself and maybe she can touch on that.
Yeah, so the small group meetings are next Monday, Tuesday, and then there's another one on October 7th.
Thanks, Megan. Okay, Melissa, did we receive any more public comments, or can we officially?
We don't have, yeah, we don't have any at this time.
Great, thank you. Any final thoughts, questions? If not, I'll thank you again, everyone, for joining. We always appreciate your thoughtful comments. Have a good rest of the evening, and look forward to the next time.
Bye,
Thanks
everyone.
again.
Take care, everybody.
Thank
Bye,
you all.
everyone.
Thank you.